One, the contract signatures match your NYCHA employee ID. Every payment matches a
You can't just come in here without following proper procedure.
Once is a mistake. Twice is suspicious. Juan Mercado did this hundreds of times across nearly a decade and left a paper trail for every single one. By the time this footage ends, he will be facing federal bribery charges that make him the largest individual taker in the biggest single-day corruption sweep in the history of the Department of Justice.
I have rights.
$1.8 million in contracts steered to contractors who paid you kickback.
At $329,300, $1,886,000 in repair contracts, nearly a decade of plumbing calls, window jobs, and broken radiators in Queens public housing, every one of them with a price tag attached before the work began. The man in this footage is the single largest taker in the biggest one-day bribery takedown in the history of the United States Department of Justice. By the time federal agents finished adding up the ledger, every signed contract traced back to a signed envelope of cash. The arithmetic was the entire case. Quick question. When was the last time you actually thought about the person who fixes the heat in your building? The super, the maintenance lead, the guy with the keys to every apartment? Drop a comment and tell me if you even know their name. And if you're not subscribed, hit that button. This channel covers the public trust cases nobody else touches, and we do it every single week. Juan Mercado was born in Brooklyn in 1974, the second of 4 children in a Puerto Rican family that had come up from Aguadilla in the late 1960s. His father worked night maintenance at a textile warehouse off Flushing Avenue in Bushwick. His mother cleaned offices in the financial district, leaving the apartment before sunrise and coming home after the kids were already eating dinner with their grandmother. The apartment itself was a 2-bedroom railroad walk-up on Knickerbocker Avenue with a radiator that knocked all winter and a kitchen window that never closed all the way, no matter how many times his father shimmed it. Juan grew up watching his father fix things: the radiator, the window, the hallway light bulb, the leaking tub faucet, the intercom buzzer that never worked, the lock on the front door of the building that the landlord refused to replace for 11 years. In the Mercado household, the idea that you waited for somebody else to come fix your apartment was a kind of joke, a thing only people in television commercials did. His father carried a battered red metal toolbox up and down the 4-flight stairwell, so often that the handle had worn smooth and the latch had been rebent twice with a pair of pliers. He went to Bushwick High School, where he was a quiet kid with mediocre grades and good attendance. Teachers later remembered him as polite, helpful with the audio-visual cart, willing to stay late and help the custodian stack chairs in the auditorium after assemblies. His guidance counselor wrote on a senior year evaluation that he was a, quote, dependable young man with steady hands and a respectful manner, end quote, and predicted that he would do well in the building trades. He graduated in 1992 with an 80 average and no plans for college. For the first 3 years out of high school, he worked at a hardware store on Wyckoff Avenue, making $7 an hour, cutting keys, mixing paint, and explaining the difference between PVC and CPVC to landlords who didn't want to be told. He picked up plumbing knowledge by osmosis. He took a night class in basic electrical at LaGuardia Community College in 1994 and another in HVAC fundamentals in 1995. He never finished the certificate, but he kept the textbooks on a shelf in his bedroom for the next 28 years. In 1996, at 22, he met Marisol Rivera at her cousin's birthday party in Ridgewood. They married in 1998 at a small ceremony at her parents' house in Bushwick with a rose con gandules from a caterer on Knickerbocker and a borrowed sound system playing salsa and freestyle for 6 hours in the backyard. Their first child Janelle, was born in 2000. Their second, Anthony, in 2003. By the time Anthony was born, they had moved out to West Babylon on Long Island, into a small split level on a quiet residential street, with a chain-link fence around the back and a maple tree that dropped helicopters across the driveway every spring. He had taken his first steady paycheck job in 1997, doing building maintenance for a private property management company in Ridgewood that ran a portfolio of 6-story walk-ups in Bushwick and East New York. The work was constant: gas leaks, water leaks, tenants locked out, intercoms dying, dishwashers nobody was supposed to have installed in the first place. He learned how to talk to people in their worst moments. He learned how to be the guy who came up the stairs when the heat had been out for 2 days in February. He learned that the job of building maintenance is half repair and half priesthood, because the person on the other side of the door is, more often than not, frightened and tired, and at the end of a long line of unanswered phone calls. He joined the New York City Housing Authority in 2004. His application listed 7 years of property maintenance experience, a basic electrical certificate, and a recommendation letter from his former boss describing him as, quote, reliable, calm under pressure, and capable of managing multiple buildings without direct supervision, end quote. NYCHA hired him as a caretaker J, the lowest rung of on-site building staff, at the Queensbridge Houses in Long Island City, the largest public housing development in North America. His starting salary was $41,000 a year with full city benefits and a pension. He was a caretaker for 2 years, then promoted to maintenance worker in 2006. Maintenance worker for 4 years, then promoted to assistant superintendent in 2010. By 2013, he was a full superintendent assigned to a Queens-based development, with formal authority to award no-bid contracts for repair work under $10,000 and to sign off on the paperwork that paid contractors after the job was complete. His salary that year was just over $78,000. He was 39 years old. His daughter was 13. His son was 10. The split level in West Babylon had 11 years left on the mortgage and a basement that flooded twice every spring. To understand what Juan Mercado did, you have to understand the system he was handed the keys to. The New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, is the largest public housing authority in the United States. Roughly 1 in every 17 New Yorkers lives in a NYCHA apartment. More than 300 individual developments, over 2,600 residential buildings. Around 500,000 people, give or take, depending on whose count you trust. Federal funding alone exceeds $1.5 billion every single year. The full operating budget runs higher. It is, in scale, larger than the entire municipal government of most American cities, and it is run, building by building, by superintendents. The superintendent is the on-the-ground decision-maker. He decides which contractor walks through the door of which apartment to fix the busted radiator. He decides whose plumbing call gets answered this week and whose gets pushed to next month. He decides which buildings get the new window units before winter and which ones don't. He signs off on the paperwork that says the work was done. He signs off on the paperwork that says the contractor should be paid. In the world of public housing, the superintendent is closer to a tenant's daily life than any elected official, any commissioner, any agency director on the org chart. The mayor's name is on the building. The super's name is on the work order. Now the procurement rules. Every dollar NYCHA spends is supposed to flow through a competitive bidding process. Vendors apply. Bids are reviewed. Contracts are awarded based on price and qualifications, with documentation at every stage. That is how the system is supposed to work for any job valued over $10,000. But a public housing authority cannot run a competitive bidding process for a leaking pipe. A leaking pipe is an emergency. A broken window in January is an emergency. A jammed elevator with a wheelchair user inside it is an emergency. The procurement bureaucracy that exists for million-dollar capital projects cannot be the same procurement bureaucracy that exists for a Saturday morning plumbing call. So, NYCHA, like almost every other large public agency in America, carved out a fast-track exception. Any repair job valued under $10,000 could be awarded directly by the site staff to a vendor of their choice without competitive bidding. These were called micro-purchase contracts, no-bid contracts. The carve-out existed for one reason: to let the superintendent fix a small problem fast without grinding the request through a multi-week procurement queue. The carve-out was the entire exploit. It was the carve-out that put the choice of vendor into a single person's hands. It was the carve-out that turned the superintendent's signature into a thing of measurable monetary value to any contractor who wanted NYCHA work. And it was the carve-out, that single procurement rule, written for the most defensible of reasons, that made the next decade of Queens public housing repair work into one long opportunity for a toll booth. Nobody at the top of the agency was watching individual sub-$10,000 contracts. The dollar values were too small. The volume was too high. The contracts were spread across hundreds of buildings. The internal audit function was undermanned and overstretched. Tenants complained about conditions constantly, about rodents, about mold, about heat outages, about hot water outages, about ceilings falling in on cribs, and the complaints became background noise. The agency's reputation for being slow and bad at repairs gave cover to the very people exploiting the speed mechanism that had been built to fix the slowness. It was, in retrospect, an almost perfectly designed environment for graft. Small dollar values, decentralized authority, vulnerable tenants who had no leverage to demand a better contractor, a backlog so deep that any work getting done at all looked like progress. And at the choke point, at every single door of every single apartment where a faucet needed replacing or a radiator needed bleeding, one superintendent with one signature. That trust was about to be tested. The exact first contract Juan Mercado took money on has never been publicly identified. Federal prosecutors traced the scheme back to at least 2014, when Mercado was a year into his role as superintendent at a Queens development. The indictment describes only as one of multiple NYCHA properties under his control over the relevant period. The mechanism, once it started, never changed. Step 1. Identify a contractor willing to pay. The plumbing trade in Queens, like the plumbing trade everywhere, runs on word of mouth. Mercado knew which one-truck operators were hungry for steady NYCHA work, and which ones were big enough to walk away from anything that smelled wrong. He focused on the hungry ones. A licensed plumber with 2 employees and a payment due on a Ford E350 van does not have the leverage to refuse a deal that comes from the man holding the work orders. Step 2. Steer the contract. Mercado would issue a micro-purchase contract, almost always priced just under the $10,000 ceiling, to the cooperating contractor. The job was real. The work was needed. The apartment in question had an actual leaking pipe or an actual broken window. The choice of who fixed it was the variable he controlled. Step 3. Collect. The price per contract ran between $500 and $2,000. Cash, almost always. Sometimes handed off in a stairwell, sometimes in a parked car on a side street near the development. Sometimes inside the superintendent's basement office, the door closed, the envelope handed across the desk and slid into a drawer. The amount scaled, roughly, with the size of the contract. A $2,000 window repair might come with a $500 kickback. A $9,000 plumbing job might come with $2,000. Step 4. Sign the paperwork on the back end. Once the work was done, NYCHA required the on-site supervisor to sign a form confirming the job had been completed and authorizing payment to the contractor. Without that signature, the vendor did not get paid. With it, the check went out on the normal NYCHA payment cycle. Mercado signed. The contractor got paid. The kickback had already been delivered. Step 5. Repeat across the rest of 2014, across all of 2015, across 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, and into the summer of 2023. Hundreds of contracts, hundreds of envelopes, hundreds of small repair jobs across Queens public housing that were never about who could do the work best, just who could pay the super. The pattern was relentless and quiet. Mercado did not buy a yacht. He did not buy a Lamborghini. He did not move to a beach house. He kept the same split level in West Babylon. He kept driving the same older model Nissan to work. He took family vacations to Puerto Rico every couple of years, sometimes Disney with the kids. He paid down the mortgage faster than the schedule called for. He kept up with his daughter's college tuition at SUNY Old Westbury without taking out student loans. He carried less credit card debt than a man on a $78,000 salary with 2 kids should have been carrying. Nothing flashy, nothing that would make a neighbor stop and ask questions. The bribes were absorbed into the slow, steady arithmetic of a working-class household. Paying things off a little faster, breathing a little easier, sending the kids to college without the stress everybody else on the block was carrying. The kind of upward drift that does not look like a crime to anyone watching from the outside, because it does not look like anything at all. But the contractors were keeping records. Every contractor who paid him remembered the meetings, the amounts, the locations, the dates, the faces. Plumbers who had handed envelopes across desks remembered which envelope went to which super. Some of them kept notes. Some of them kept text message threads. Some of them kept the receipts for the cash withdrawals that funded the bribes themselves. And while Mercado was operating quietly, the buildings he was supposed to be running were deteriorating around the tenants who lived in them. Queens NYCHA developments during the years of Mercado's scheme had the same problems as NYCHA developments everywhere. Rodents in the walls, mold blooming behind kitchen sinks, heat outages in February that lasted 48, 72, 96 hours, hot water outages that lasted longer, elevators stuck on the 14th floor for an entire weekend, children with asthma, retirees on oxygen, disabled tenants who could not leave their apartments, shift workers coming home from overnight jobs to no heat, and a leaking ceiling and a phone line at the management office that nobody answered. The repair work Mercado controlled was the exact category of work that decided whether those apartments were livable. Plumbing, window repairs, pipe insulation, heating elements, the slow daily maintenance of a building's habitability. And every job that crossed his desk had to pay him before it got fixed. The contractor selected was the contractor who paid, not the contractor who fixed the problem best, not the contractor who fixed it fastest, not the contractor who fixed it cheapest, the one who paid. For nearly a decade, that is how plumbing got fixed in the Queens NYCHA buildings Juan Mercado was responsible for. And nobody outside that closed circle of contractors knew. The catalyst was not a single whistleblower. It was not a single contractor walking into the FBI field office in Manhattan with a notebook and a story. It was the slow, parallel accumulation of evidence by half a dozen federal and city agencies that had been quietly looking into NYCHA contracting for years. Federal investigators had started pulling on threads as early as 2020. The Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Inspector General, HUD-OIG, had been receiving complaints about NYCHA procurement for longer than that. The Department of Labor's Office of Inspector General had jurisdiction over the labor side issues, including misclassified workers on NYCHA contracts. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division was interested in the cash flow on the contractor side, where bribes were being funded through structured withdrawals and unreported income. Homeland Security Investigations had its own pieces. The FBI was running the lead. The New York City Department of Investigation, DOI, had been working NYCHA cases for years and brought institutional memory the federal partners did not have. The break came from the contractors themselves, not one, many, spread across years, as federal agents began approaching contractors who had won NYCHA repair work, quietly, at home, away from job sites. A pattern emerged. Contractors started cooperating. Some of them were already under investigation for unrelated issues and used cooperation as leverage. Some of them simply wanted out. Years of being shaken down for every single contract had created a deep reservoir of resentment. The agents listened, took notes, recorded statements, compared one contractor's account against another's, found that the same superintendent's name kept coming up. Mercado's name came up over and over again, and over, and over. By late 2023, the federal team had assembled bribe payment accounts from multiple contractors who had paid Mercado specifically. They had dates, they had locations, they had dollar amounts. They had, in some cases, contemporaneous text messages between contractors and the people inside their own operations, describing the payments that had just been made. The contractors had been talking among themselves for years. There was a vocabulary for it. There was an understanding of who took what, and where, and how often. And now that vocabulary was on the record. In parallel, investigators pulled NYCHA's own contracting data. Every micro-purchase contract Mercado had signed off on. Every payment authorization he had approved. The volume was significant. From 2014 through July 2023, the contracts he had signed totaled approximately $1,886,000 in NYCHA repair work. Plumbing, window repair, other essential building work, spread across multiple Queens developments, all of it just under the $10,000 bidding threshold. Almost none of it ever competitively bid. When investigators laid the contractor bribery accounts against the NYCHA contract data, the alignment was almost mechanical. Bribes paid in the same months as contracts awarded. Bribe amounts scaled to contract values. Contractor names matching one-to-one with the vendors he had selected. The two ledgers, when laid side by side, were the same ledger. The sweep was being planned for early February 2024. 70 current and former NYCHA employees in total. Mercado was the largest single taker among them. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York was preparing what would be announced as the largest single-day bribery takedown in the history of the United States Department of Justice. Mercado had no idea. The investigation that closed in on Juan Mercado was, in its final shape, an arithmetic exercise. The smoking gun was not a single recorded conversation. It was not a wire. It was not a sting-by. It was the column of small numbers. Federal prosecutors, working with the FBI, HUD-OIG, DOL-OIG, IRSCI, HSI, and the New York City Department of Investigation, built a single master spreadsheet. On the left side of the spreadsheet were the contracts. Every NYCHA micro-purchase contract Mercado had signed off on from 2014 through the summer of 2023. Contract number, date, vendor, building, dollar amount, type of work, signature on file. On the right side of the spreadsheet were the bribes, reconstructed from contractor statements, contractor financial records, contractor text messages, contractor cash withdrawal patterns and direct interviews, amount, date, method of delivery, location of handoff, vendor identity, person paid. We're heading into the trial now. If you want to know exactly how a case like this actually closes, how a column of $500 envelopes becomes a federal sentencing memo, subscribe. We break down every detail, every week. Stories like this don't get the attention they deserve. If you appreciate accountability coverage, hit that button and share this video with somebody who needs to see it. The two sides of the spreadsheet aligned with a precision that was almost embarrassing for the defense. When a contractor reported paying Mercado $1,500 on a Tuesday in March of 2017, there was, that same week, a signed contract awarded to that contractor for a roughly $7,000 plumbing job in a Queens NYCHA building. When a contractor reported a $1,000 handoff in a stairwell in October 2019, there was, within days, a corresponding window repair contract under $9,000 going out to the same vendor with Mercado's signature on the authorization line. The federal sentencing memorandum laid it out in the bluntest possible language. $329,300 in bribes accepted, $1,886,000 in NYCHA contracts directed to the paying contractors, hundreds of individual transactions, a nearly perfect signal in the data. The physical evidence corroborated the arithmetic. Search warrants executed at Mercado's home in West Babylon recovered documents, electronic records, and financial records consistent with the pattern. Bank records showed that his household finances, while not lavish, ran consistently ahead of what his NYCHA salary alone should have supported. The mortgage paid down faster than schedule, college tuition paid out of pocket, cash deposits that, when laid against the schedule of bribes, lined up with the same precision as the contract ledger. Text messages between contractors and their own employees recovered from devices included references to, quote, the super in Queens, end quote, and, quote, paying Juan, end quote, and, quote, dropped envelope to Jay this morning, end quote. None of it was coded with any sophistication. The contractors had never expected their phones to be in a federal evidence locker. They had been writing for an audience of one, themselves, and they had documented their own crimes in the process. The interviews of cooperating contractors added the human texture. One contractor described being summoned to Mercado's basement office to be told, in so many words, that any plumber who wanted continued work at the development would need to, quote, take care of the super, end quote. Another described handing over an envelope of cash in a parked car on a side street in Long Island City and being told to keep coming back. A third described an early conversation in which Mercado had named the percentage he expected from any contract he steered, and held to that percentage with the discipline of a man running a small business, because that, in effect, was what he was running. There was no single piece of evidence that ended the case. The case was the totality. Hundreds of transactions, each one small, each one documented, each one provable, adding up over nearly a decade to a single sentence in a sentencing memo. $329,300 taken, $1,886,000 in public housing repair contracts steered. The arithmetic was the conviction. The arithmetic was the truth. The morning of February 6, 2024 was cold and gray in West Babylon. Federal agents in raid vests arrived at the split level on the quiet residential street just before 6 a.m. The maple tree in the front yard was bare. The chain-link fence had a thin crust of frost on the top rail. Mercado answered the door in a gray t-shirt and sweatpants. His wife was behind him in the hallway in a bathrobe. Both kids were grown and out of the house. The house was quiet except for the kitchen radio playing a Spanish-language morning show. The lead agent identified himself, said the words federal warrant, said the words bribery and extortion. Mercado stood in the doorway with one hand still on the inside knob and looked past the agent into the front yard where two more agents and a marked vehicle were waiting on the curb. He did not run. He did not yell. He did not argue. He asked one question. Mercado, can my wife stay inside? Agent, yes, we need you to step out, sir. Mercado, can I get my coat? Agent, Officer Reyes will get it. Step out, sir. He stepped out. Marisol was crying in the hallway behind him. He did not look back. One of the agents handed him a navy parka from the coat hook. Another agent put the cuffs on him on the front walkway, between the rose bush his wife had planted in 2009 and the cracked concrete steps he had patched himself the summer before. The cuffs went on quietly. He did not pull away. He did not flex his wrists. Agent, do you understand the charges I just read you, sir? Mercado, yes. Agent, do you want to make any statement right now? Mercado, no. Agent, you sure? Mercado, I want a lawyer. That was it. 3 words. The conversation was over. He sat in the back of the vehicle on the way into Manhattan for processing and looked out the window at the Long Island Expressway in the dark and did not speak again. At 1 St. Andrew's Plaza, he was processed alongside dozens of other NYCHA superintendents and assistant superintendents from across the 5 boroughs. Some of them he had known for years. Some of them he had only ever heard about by reputation. They sat in adjacent holding rooms. Some of them were crying. One of them, a super from a Bronx development whose name had also come up repeatedly in contractor interviews, kept asking the marshals what the maximum sentence was. Mercado did not ask anything. He sat with his hands in his lap and waited for his lawyer. Later that morning, U.S. Attorney Damian Williams stood at a podium and announced the takedown. 70 current and former NYCHA employees charged. Nearly 100 buildings affected. Almost a third of all NYCHA developments. $2,100,000 in bribes. Over $15 million in steered contracts. The largest single-day bribery takedown in the history of the United States Department of Justice. Juan Mercado was named in the public release as the single largest taker. The case was assigned to United States District Judge Valerie E. Caproni in the Southern District of New York. Judge Caproni had spent more than a decade on the federal bench by 2024 and had previously served as general counsel of the FBI. She was known for being prepared, exacting, and unimpressed by speeches. Mercado was represented by a court-appointed defense attorney from the Federal Defender's Office. The strategy from the first conference was guilty plea and mitigation. There was no path through trial. The arithmetic was unanswerable. The contracts existed. The contractors had testified. The bank records lined up. The choice was not whether to be convicted, but how to position himself for sentencing. The guilty plea was entered before Judge Caproni in 2024. The plea covered bribery and extortion offenses tied to the broader scheme. Mercado allocuted in a quiet voice, reading from a prepared statement, acknowledging that he had accepted payments from contractors in exchange for steering NYCHA contracts to them, and that he had signed payment authorizations to ensure those contractors were paid. He confirmed the dollar amounts. He did not contest the contract count. He did not contest the bribery total. The sentencing memorandum from the government was 38 pages long and laid out every line of the arithmetic. Across the full sweep, prosecutors noted, 56 of the 70 defendants had pleaded guilty to felonies. 11 had pleaded to misdemeanors. 3 had been convicted at trial. Total bribes across all defendants, more than $2.1 million. Total NYCHA contracts steered, more than $15 million. Mercado, the government argued, was the single largest taker. $329,300 in personal bribery proceeds. $1,886,000 in repair contracts directed to paying vendors. Nearly a decade of conduct. Hundreds of individual acts of corruption. A breach of public trust, the memorandum said, that ran to the most vulnerable residents of the city. Public housing tenants in Queens who had no leverage to demand better. The defense memorandum was shorter. It described a Puerto Rican kid from Bushwick, a father who had worked night maintenance, a mother who had cleaned offices, a boy who had learned to fix things at his father's knee, a young man who had worked his way up from a hardware store on Wyckoff Avenue to a steady NYCHA job, a husband and father who had supported his family, paid down his mortgage, and put his daughter through college. The defense did not deny the conduct. It asked Judge Caproni to weigh the conduct against the rest of the life. Judge Caproni heard the arguments on January 31st, 2025. A representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office, on behalf of newly installed U.S. Attorney Danielle R. Sassoon, addressed the court. The statement described Mercado's conduct as a years-long abuse of public trust by a public housing superintendent. It said he had, in effect, diverted money meant to improve the lives of NYCHA residents, money that was supposed to fix their pipes and their windows and their broken radiators, into his own pocket, contract by contract, envelope by envelope. The statement asked the court to impose a sentence that reflected both the duration of the conduct and the vulnerability of the victims. There was no live victim impact testimony from an NYCHA tenant. The tenants were, in legal terms, an indirect class of victim, but the prosecutor's statement made the point in plain language. The victims, she said, were the families in the Queens buildings Mercado had run for nearly a decade. The children in those apartments, the retirees, the disabled tenants, the shift workers who came home to no heat. Every leaking pipe in Queens that crossed Juan Mercado's desk, she said, had to pay him before it got fixed. That was the case. That was what he had done. Judge Caproni delivered the sentence. She acknowledged the defense's portrait of Mercado's upbringing and family life. She acknowledged that this was not, in the financial sense, the most lavish corruption case the court had ever seen. She acknowledged that he had not used the money for jets or yachts or beach houses. And then she said that the modesty of the use to which he had put the money did not diminish the seriousness of the underlying conduct. That, if anything, it underscored how casually he had treated the trust placed in him. He had not stolen to escape his life. He had stolen, slowly and steadily, while continuing to live it. For nearly a decade, she said, the people who depended on him as their building superintendent had been losers in a corrupt market they did not know existed. The contractor who fixed their plumbing was not the contractor who could do it best. It was the contractor who could pay him. She sentenced him to 48 months in federal prison. 3 years of supervised release to follow. $329,300 in restitution. An additional $329,300 in forfeiture. 48 months, 4 years. The longest sentence imposed in the NYCHA sweep to that date. He stood at the defense table in a dark suit and listened with his hands folded in front of him, and did not visibly react. Marisol was in the gallery. His daughter Janelle was beside her. His son Anthony was on the other side. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. The arithmetic had spoken for them. He was designated to a low-security federal facility. With good time credit and program participation, his projected release date would put him back home in West Babylon when he was in his mid-50s. The mortgage on the split level would be paid off by then. The maple tree in the front yard would still drop helicopters across the driveway every spring. The chain-link fence would still be there. The basement would still flood every March. The NYCHA sweep as a whole continued. Of the 70 defendants charged on February 6, 2024, 56 pleaded guilty to felony offenses, 11 pleaded guilty to misdemeanors, and 3 were convicted at trial. Collectively, they were responsible for over $2.1 million in bribes in exchange for awarding NYCHA contracts worth over $15 million. The sweep was, and remains, the largest single-day bribery takedown in Department of Justice history. The procurement reform inside NYCHA that followed it was extensive. The micro-purchase carve-out, the rule that had made the whole scheme possible, was tightened. Authorization layers were added. Cooling-off periods between contractor selections were introduced. Surprise audits of repair, contracting at the building level, became routine. None of it brought back the years. In the Queens NYCHA buildings Juan Mercado had run from 2014 to 2023, the radiators still knocked in winter. The windows still didn't close all the way. The tenants still waited on hold with the central maintenance line. But the contractor who walked through the door now, for the first time in nearly a decade, was the contractor who could fix the problem, not the contractor who could pay the super. That case was infuriating. But this next case on the right-hand side is even more outrageous. And the man at the center of it walked into his own arrest without ever realizing it had already happened. Click it now.